Looks like it is. Working? It is on. So,
The beach.
why don't you all both sit over here?
Over there?
Yeah, sit over here. And I want to welcome you all to Gaze, Photographing Detroit. My name is Bob Beauregard. I'm a professor of urban planning here at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's event. The event has two very general purposes. One is to reflect on the use of photography to capture and convey the meaning of cities. In this vein, photographs are seen as mediated forms of documentation. They both present and they represent. And when they represent, they begin to become both political and aesthetic. The second purpose is to reflect on the once prosperous city of Detroit, a city that's become more famous for its ruins than it is for its accomplishments. Speaking tonight will be three individuals who have chosen the photograph as the medium through which to represent Detroit. In order of speaking, they are Camilo José Vergara, a writer, photographer, documentarian who's been photographing cities like Detroit and neighborhoods like Harlem since the late 1970s. His books include New American Ghetto and American Ruins. In 2002, he received a MacArthur grant, and his photographs have been shown all over the world, including such venues as the National Building Museum. Our second speaker will be Andrew Moore, an internationally renowned artist who works in large format color photography. One of his most recent books is Detroit Disassembled, a book you can purchase up at the back of the room. Detroit Disassembled, photographs from that book became a show which originated in Akron, Ohio, then went to the Queens Museum in New York City, and are now at the National Building Museum. Our third speaker will be Danielle Aubert, who's an assistant professor of graphic design at Wayne State University in Detroit. Her work has been featured in such books as Young Graphic Designers of America and Fully Booked. She is co-editor with Natasha, Chandani, and Lana Cavar of Thanks for the View, Mr. Mies, a study of Mies van der Rohe's Lafayette Park residential project in Detroit, another book which you can purchase at the back of the room. Commenting on their presentations will be Andrew Herscher. Andrew taught here last semester in the Historic Preservation Program. He's an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan with a joint appointment in Slavic Studies. His most recent book is Violence Taking Place, The Architecture of the Kosovo Conflict. And he has a forthcoming book with a wonderful title, The Unreal Estate Guide to Detroit. After Andrew's comments, we'll open it up for questions and answers. But before bringing Camilo up here, I want to apologize to our photographers tonight for this yellow spot. It seems like we have a projector problem, and we can't get that yellow spot to go away. So I know how photographers are about their images, so we apologize for that. So let's begin with Camilo José Vergara.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And remember the first time I was here, I was completely incoherent and couldn't get a word out, but people were very polite and stayed and was able to finish and was here. And it was quite an experience. And since then I've gone to many other places and try to make things easier. Any case, what I do, let me start with, why is it moving? Why is it showing pictures? How can you get to the beginning? Hope the time is not clicking. Yeah. Hmm? Yeah. Well, I wanted to start. I see the picture here. I click. I see it clicking here. It moves, but there's no picture. That's why you put me through. Add the picture's time to my comment. But in any case, I started photographing in 1970. By that time, particularly in New York City, and particularly in the Bronx, buildings were growing so fast that there was an item in the Times every day in the metro section that said how many buildings burned in the Bronx. So after trying for a few years to do street photography, I realized that somehow it was very important to keep track of those buildings because the change was so fast, the Bronx was changing so fast, that I had to invent a way to do that, to photograph the landscape of the Bronx of the 1970s so that there would be a record and I could understand what was happening there. So every single picture that I would take would be like a question mark. What's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? I also developed a system of photographing which had to do with different levels. So some pictures were taken from the ground, some pictures were taken from above. And as I photographed, here is an example. This is a picture from Detroit that shows the Detroit of 1991. I went on taking this picture every year until 2003 when the building was bricked and boarded up in such a way that nobody could get in anymore. So this is a view of Detroit that really impressed me and made me think of all that bulk, of all those buildings, of all that work that had gone into creating those buildings. And I would say half of the buildings that you're seeing there were at that time abandoned, and many of them have been since demolished. I began with photographing buildings over time. That was a building that I photographed in 1991. This is 1993. This is 1997. And here, oops, sorry. And this is about 1999, 2000, 2002. And my view first was this building is going to disappear. I'm here to watch how it falls apart, which was okay with me. And I didn't know what was the next step. The next step was that the city decides to fix the building. So this picture is in 2007, but they decided to fix the building in such a way that they didn't complete fixing it. So the result is that from about 2004, 2005, when they finished and put a new roof on the building stayed abandoned. And so the process could start all over again. So I could redo these pictures. And I think, to me, this series is very important because it shows how buildings keep moving. Buildings are not still, and you cannot predict the story. You cannot predict the trajectory. And what you can do is get enough of those trajectories so as to be able to, from those trajectories then, to be able to generalize to some degree. This is another example. This is the Packard plant, huge automobile plant, which at this time was devoted to be used to store cardboard, to store shoes that were going to Nicaragua, to fix cars, to take stolen cars to take apart, and then it was used for raves, that people had music there. They would install generators, they would come in, and they would have parties, and parties where people got together in an improvised version because they were illegal parties. Then afterwards, they had these battles with paintball, you know, they showed each other. There were battles that went on in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day in these buildings. At one point, half of the building was demolished before somebody came in and said, that's my building, I own it. The city doesn't have a right to continue destroying it. And since then, this picture was taken in 2001. Since then, Detroit became a magnet, and this building is really an art gallery. So different muralists from all over the world, including Banksy, have come in and have done their work there. And it's an honor to be able to do your work in Detroit. So this is what it looks like now. So in combination, there's two things happening. On the one hand, nature is taking over. The building continues to fall apart, and stripping continues. And the artists continue to come in. So you may come in there and you find a French family with the kids and all coming out, and they're very friendly and somehow afraid, but maybe not too afraid. So they visit the place and they're enchanted by it. The train station. I'm not going to put you through all the pictures since 1991 that I have of the train station, but it's also the same story. There is no definitive picture of a ruin, like there is no definite pictures of the Colosseum in Rome. One single picture that tells you everything about it. This is a story that began in 1991, and it also goes to 2002, and I'm just going to show you the 2002 picture. In the middle, it was also a similar story to the house that I showed you, that after undergoing the process of abandonment, goes into a stage where it gets fixed, or somewhat fixed. So in 2012, they've taken over the windows that were all broken, all because of some really odd entanglement that involves the building a bridge up to Canada, a billionaire whose reputation is being smirched because he owns the building, and then in television, there is a succession of commercials that show him as being the owner of this eyesore. Ruins continue, so we have modern ruins. Now, this is a building that was just abandoned like a month ago, maybe a year ago. So this building now is going to start its trajectory as a ruin. And I don't know what that trajectory is going to be. Ruins are affected by really strange things. Like in this case, this head of a steer was used in a movie called 8 Mile. And for that movie, the art director decided that he was going to paint the steer. So they get affected by, you know, the people that go and do their murals, the people that feel that they can take something out of them. So again, that's what I want to stress. Ruins are alive, and in more than one ways. There are people in Detroit. These are two people that sort of stay. You find, not that common, but you do find the people that sort of didn't see the transition of Detroit from being a white city, affluent city, mostly white, into a black city, but they just stay there. So they have a little shop, and you know, they are in their last days. You know, they probably, I will go to this place, it's called Spring Grove, Spring Grove. And they probably won't be there and the place will be closed. There's the people who recycle the machinery. This is a place called Little Nell, I think the name of the place is, or something like that. And what they have is that the machinery that comes out of those big factories in Detroit is then put there and classified in different piles, you know. Some that go to Mexico because they still function, some that are sold to Korea or some other place to make whatever they make there, and some that stay there. There are folks that fix cars, you know, like, what's his name? Terry, that is in this picture. Or Mexicans. A lot of Latinos are coming to Detroit, and they're expanding, and some of them are moving north into areas that were 100% black. And they're somehow rebuilding some of the houses, or the abandoned houses. And then there is a whole rich side, a rich folk tradition in Detroit, which is exemplified by storefront, churches like this. This is not quite a storefront church. Or by graphics like this. And I think some of these graphics, and I was happy to put this in a magazine, and then I look at Obama graphics, and I see it sort of move and in Google and sort of move up in the Obama graphic category. There is something playful and something, there's a very rich tradition, vein there in Detroit that can be exemplified here. Of course, a mural influenced by transportation, painted by a homeless man in Detroit. And then there is the work that is brought by people that come to Detroit from places, in this case, Rotterdam. Some people, 4 women planners, designers, I believe, came from Rotterdam with the idea that it would help Detroit's reputation if they could convince people in churches to change the word God in their signs with the word Detroit. So they went to a church. They only succeeded, I believe, in this church. And they convinced the pastor that this was the subject of their preaching, was God is no dry bones. God, you should, you know, something like that. And that was from the Gospel of Ezekiel. So the minister said, yes, go ahead, do it. And that came up, and that became the title of my presentation, because it expressed the ambiguity of Detroit. You know, at the same time being a city in decline, a city that it's extremely high crime rate, very poor, extremely poor performing institutions like hospitals and churches and the police, of course, while at the same time is perceived by people all over the world as some sort of a magnet, some place that they have to see for whatever reason, and that it's going to enhance their lives and they can create lives for themselves there. I don't know. Well, here I have a whole section that I put together for you, and this I call New Architecture in Detroit. How many minutes do I have? Okay, New Architecture in Detroit. So what is happening is that families, mainly Albanians and Greeks, have started taking buildings that exist right there and covering with this covering that's called drive-it, that can be very colorful and sort of bulky and give robustness and a presence to buildings, make them arresting. I mean, the idea is that you're driving by and that you will stop and have your eggs and bacon in this place because it looks like a friendly, good place. That's another example. In this case, I actually have the after picture, which was taken like 2 years after this picture, and then it was already out of business. So it had a sign, it had everything on, but it's not operating. that one, as far as my last visit, it stands pretty much the way it is without the Christmas tree. But you can see how a basic building here gets like a crown or a hat, and it sort of attracts attention and shows that it's alive. And here it almost recalls the fins and all those things that you used to put in the cars of the 60s and 50s. Again, see a whole street. This is another kind of shot that I take often, which is taking the whole block. The idea that I have in the back of my mind is to photograph the entire city and to photograph every single building and to get to the roof of every tall building that I can find. Of course, I never do it because it's impossible, but I try to do as much of that as I can. So with this one, here is the way it looks today. So that's 23 years of that block, 20 years of that block. So all that survives in that block, it's still standing, I believe, is a building here. So this is the way it is. And before, they used to put these things in the buildings, you know, there were all these efforts to kind of make the blocks popular again, to bring people back in again. And that was one of the attitudes, one of the ways to promote the block, even as it looked all abandoned. And here, I believe, is my last two sets of pictures. This photograph was a really hot day in Detroit, and I went to that neighborhood, and even then, I believe that to find any occupied building, you have to go over here, and perhaps there were some buildings that were occupied, and that the neighborhood had undergone some sort of revitalization of some form. You can see those planters there. So I decided to go back and redo the same picture, and that's what it looks like now. I mean, that was, of course, after the rain, but you can still see where the planters are. And you can see how green is taking over. So you have this extraordinary city that continues to attract people, and I believe it will attract more and more and more people in the future. And I think that's going to have an effect eventually as the numbers grow and turn around the city in some way or some form of the city. So far, the movement of people it's probably within a mile around from the downtown. And the city, of course, has 8 miles. You have some places where there are institutions or people that are trying to reclaim a part of Detroit, or Highland Park, or Hamtramck, somewhere away from that. But so far, you know, this new redevelopment is happening close to the center, and it's also basically a white college graduate sort of development, very ambitious people who are very internet adept. And I think that really the interesting thing is that there is a Detroit on the ground, and then there is a Detroit on cyberspace. That it's visited, people go there, and oftentimes more important even than the Detroit that you're seeing that is right here on the ground. I wonder if that's, yeah. So, you know, with that, I'd just like to hear your comments later and hear what the rest are going to say. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you to Bob and Andrew for organizing this, and thank you to Camilo for that amazing presentation. We're in a show together down in Washington. I had not met him before, and I'm completely impressed by his work. Anyway, since we're here in the School of Architecture, I'd just like to give a little bit of background and context to my work. Camilo was speaking about the Bronx before, and in fact, my dad was a commercial architect and designed the Hunts Point Meat Market in the Bronx, and was probably one of the only people who lived in Fairfield County who commuted to the South Bronx in the 1970s. Anyway, I grew up looking at blueprints, playing with balsa wood models, and kind of on Sundays we go with my family to look at building sites and on vacations. So I was very involved with architecture, and I was fortunate later in life to meet Julia Schulman, whose photographs I'd seen and became a close friend, and whose I'd seen his photographs in my father's office. But so my love for architecture is really comes from this early experience, but it also, the architecture as an artistic practice really informs my work as a photographer. So just as an architect brings space to life through the shaping of planes, I too, as an image maker, am primarily concerned with the shaping of pictorial space through the formal design of the picture plane. And although some of this aesthetic derives from my apprenticeship with Emmett Gowan, kind of master teacher, the underpinnings of my picture-making aesthetic comes from my desire to build spaces, albeit in a photograph. Now, obviously, architecture is more than just the shaping of space, so I should mention that my third great love is really history. And if architecture, as Octavio Paz has said, is the incorruptible witness to history, then what I'm ultimately after in my pictures is the testimony of those witnesses. And although I believe, as Camilo completely shows, that every building in some sense is a witness to its time, certain structures, at least in my perspective, uniquely inflect history and display and become intersections or connectors, to kind of steal from Malcolm Gladwell, and in the sense that time is displayed through multiple layers and multiple and different perspectives. And the pursuit of buildings that interweave these many threads of history and time is ultimately what drove my work in Detroit. This is the Metropolitan Building in Detroit. It was a home of many jewelers before it was eventually abandoned. Now, I had been in Detroit in the 90s in particular, working on a film about a Detroit-born artist named Ray Johnson, who attended the old Castec High School, and this was later put into a film called How to Draw Bunny. But my real start in Detroit began in January 2008, about 5 years ago, at the invitation of two young photographers, Yves Marchand and Roland Meffray, who later produced a book called The Ruins of Detroit. Now, they had been using some of my work on Times Square as a template for their picture making of dilapidated theaters, but they had also been exploring Detroit. And since neither of them drove a car, I guess they figured that it would be a good idea if I just, drove them around for a few weeks. So one of the first buildings that we entered was an old Methodist church on the east side. Down through this broken window, through a ladder into the basement, and then eventually up into a sanctuary, which was emblazoned with the Gothic words, "And you shall say God did it." And this was a kind of initial clue to the scenes that I would soon find. And it became readily apparent that Detroit was filled with thousands upon thousands of abandoned structures, homes, apartment buildings, factories, banks, churches, theaters. This is the beautiful United Arts Theater downtown that's kind of just kind of barely holding on these days. And many, many schools. This is in the old Castec High School. Now, of course, there are great iconic ruins, as Camilo mentioned. For instance, the Michigan train station. This is an image of the waiting room with snowdrifts in the bottom, because when I was there, the windows had all been broken out, and snow could, on this particular day, had all kind of blown in. And this is a building modeled on the great public works of Rome, which at this point in time seemed to have returned to the condition of its predecessors. Or the Rouge plant in Dearborn, which was one of the greatest industrial complexes in the world. Although on a summer afternoon when I was there in 2008, this complex, which at one time had 100,000 workers, was eerily vacant, absolutely vacant except for a few security guards driving around. Now in the late 20s, Charles Sheeler was hired by Henry Ford to document the Rouge complex. And this is a building he made of a turbine room. And without knowing this photograph, about 81 years later, I photographed the same room. And many aspects of this, but the historian from the Ford Motor Company, who, he didn't find this, but he was sort of with me on this day, on one of the days, he actually didn't know what this building was. He didn't know what it was for, he didn't know what the machine was, and he was the historian of the company. This is just known as the J9 building today. But of course there are many lesser well-known structures of equal historical significance. For instance, this is the Detroit Dry Dock building, sometimes known as the Globe Trading, but that was a kind of later company. And this is a building where young Henry Ford and his apprentice first learned of the combustion engine. And this image of the Boblo boat, which took generations of Detroiters on a kind of fantasy trip on the river to Boblo Island, and we're not only the site of many sort of first kisses, but also someone mentioned the other day their first acid trip. So, but just to go back to that church that I entered, this was one of the first pictures I made in Detroit that I really thought was interesting to me. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it sort of had some of the themes that later appeared that I kind of developed in other pictures in the book. And it shows a tiny alleyway, a kind of miniature landscape formed by human neglect and nature's relentless assertion. So one of the things you see right away, there was a kind of muted palette in Detroit, which is different than quite a few other places I had photographed. And I would try to use that sense of color. So for instance, this is a detail of the blast furnace out at the Rouge plant. Or another theme that was sort of in that picture is that where that tree is bending, this sort of surreal bending of time. This is a picture of the Michigan Theater, which was a grand movie palace that was sort of hastily chopped up into a parking garage. And then in a more literal sense of that, this melted clock, which was in a chemistry classroom in Cass Tech where a fire had been set and the heat literally melted the face of time. Or that sort of residual sense of loneliness as man's works unravel and become undone. This is a view of a courtyard in the old Cass Tech High School. This is the addition in the back. And someone compared this to a kind of malevolent dollhouse. But lastly, and this is a theme that Camilo brought up, is the persistence not of memory but of nature's fecundity, especially in an environment where a climate where the growing season is only 4 months a year. So this image is called Walden Street. It's sort of the greatest piece of topiary I found in the city. And it actually was the home of an elderly woman, and she was actually living in this building. And in fact, this last theme of urban settlement turned back into a landscape of nature's reclamation of the voids left by man was one of the themes that really intrigued me and was something that I pursued with a certain focus, although it wasn't something that I thought about before I came to Detroit. You know, as I said, I work through intuition and instinct, and it was a theme that developed as I was working there. So this is in the Packard plant, also where Camilo had those pictures of the sort of alleyway where half the building had fallen down. So I mean, the building was closed in the early 50s, and it's been used by small industries and has had, as he mentioned, all these different roles and usages, but basically it's also been harvested by scrappers all that years for choice I-beams and other pieces of metal, and the building is literally collapsing as they're stealing the metal. But even more potent, I think, in the sort of decline of Detroit is nature itself. This is an image of Henry Ford's executive office when the during the years of the production of the Model T in Highland Park. And this building was really undisturbed since the early 60s, although I think that the fixtures are actually from the 20s when this factory was abandoned, or not abandoned, but that Ford moved his operations out to Dearborn. And so what you see is that the vitality of nature has transformed an old, leftover soggy wool carpet into a lushly fluorescent bed of springtime moss. Another example of this is this image of the Detroit, the former book depository for the Detroit public school system. This is right across from the train station. It was originally a post office connected by a sort of underground tunnel. And then the school system took it over, and then it was closed, I believe, in the late 80s after a shooting in the building. And then scrappers came and vandals, and the windows were broken out. And so after years of fires and rain and snow, this sort of dense matting, the books decayed into this dense organic matter, and a grove of birch trees has sprung. So in a sense, human progress has been reversed, because instead of making books from trees, here we have trees growing out of books. So there were many sites that were very difficult. I mean, this sort of the ugly chaos sometimes of a trash school, but these trees growing out of these books felt like an act of redemption to me. And that was something that I felt very strongly there, that this decline always leads back in some way to rebirth, that history is kind of moving in a spiral, that it's turning but also moving forward, and that what dies really does prepare the way for new life. And it was a theme that I'd encountered in other projects in my work. For instance, this is an image from Sarajevo showing a geriatric home that was finished right before the war started, and then it was on the front lines right near the airport, so it was a scene of intense fighting, so therefore all the countless bullet holes and artillery shells and tank blasts. And then after the war was over, a band of gypsies returned to the city and moved back in and reclaimed it. So it has all these different, it shows the sort of resilience of, and kind of a rebirth of this building. Here's another example. This is Times Square, 42nd Street in 1995. And then just 7 years later, and I hope this doesn't happen to Detroit, the atmospheric seediness gets turned into a kind of a backdrop for corporate signage. I think that ruins have often played this role in terms of iconography in art, of marking of the one end of time and the beginning of another. And for instance, in this scene by Hans Baldung from 1500, we see beneath the most battered and humbled circumstances, the rebirth of the world. And so I would say that I had this feeling, this sort of dual feeling in Detroit, that things were desperate and heartrending, but also that the possibility of hope and renewal was constantly present and indicated, and there were signs of that. And as Camilo mentioned, there are people who are, this is a woman named Kinga. She lives on the east side on a block with a group of families that they sort of are supportive and barter amongst each other and share. And in fact, the stripes on the building are because they had a house painting party, and each of the neighbors brought a different color of paint to sort of paint the house. And she's like a kind of modern urban homesteader, living, where this man is Reverend Charles Brooks, who has promised to rebuild Detroit stone by stone, and you can see the biblical inscription on the fence that he's erecting and building. And this is also on the east side of Detroit. And here, this, another, as Camilo mentioned, obviously, many artists are working in Detroit. This is an older project. This is by a group called Object Orange, who would go out at midnight with big rollers and orange paint called Tigerific that they bought at Home Depot or something, and paint houses bright orange, paint decayed houses bright orange. And so the neighbors would wake up the next morning and see this incredibly bright orange ruin next to their house, and immediately call the city, and they would knock it down. These buildings are still undemolished because they're in Highland Park, and that municipality went bankrupt and still to this day doesn't have the money to knock these buildings And this is another project, a more recent project called the Imagination Station, which is right across the street from the Central Station, created by a group of artists, installation artists and performers. So the last time I was in Detroit, which was, I don't know, sometime in the past year, maybe 6 months ago, I was driving down Woodward, and it was so amazing to be approaching the city at night and see the lights on in the Broderick Tower. And I had this kind of great sense of joy that, you know, this kind of beacon of light, you know, it's just something that had been darkened. This is a roof party on the top of the Broderick. You see the grand sort of artery, 8-lane wide of Woodward. The baseball field, we were sort of like cheap seats above the baseball game. And you see Brush Park there, we're in the open spots, and Camilo's building is probably right over there somewhere, one of those corners. But the Broderick Tower is set to open in any day now with luxury apartments. I mean, it is an astonishing transformation within less than 5 years. So, so that's a very positive story. But there are still many, many buildings that were demolished. The Castech was demolished. Again, the Mark Twain Library and the Jane Cooper Elementary School are all gone and gone forever. And I believe that buildings are like part of the memory of the city, that once you lose them, you've lost those stories, you've lost that richness. And what comes next? Well, I'd like to conclude with just a short paragraph by Orhan Pamuk. A city's ruins also help it to forget. First, we lose a memory, but we know we've lost it and we want it back. Then we forget we have forgotten it, and the city can no longer remember its own past. The ruins that cause us such pain and open the road to forgetfulness become, in the end, the lots on which others can found new dreams. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just gonna play. Okay, so I have some slides that are just gonna play while I speak. Thanks, Robert Beauregard and Gavin Browning, for inviting me to be on the panel, and also to Andrew and Camilo. It was really great to see your work. So I'm gonna be presenting on the book Thanks for the View, Mr. Mies, with Lafayette Park, Detroit, which I co-edited and co-designed with Lana, Cavar, and Natasha Chandani. I'm based in Detroit, and Natasha is here tonight in the audience, and Lana is based in Zagreb, Croatia. So I'll just pause for. I just wanted to clarify that we're not photographers. We're actually graphic designers, and these photos were taken by the photographer Corinne Vermeulen. So basically, I'll let it go. We work together as the group Placement, which we share an interest in thinking about the way that places affect the way we live, work, and relate to the world. And this book is our first project together. So in the most simple terms, Thanks for the View, Mr. Mies is an attempt to represent in book form the experience of living in Lafayette Park, Detroit, which is an affordable, middle-class, residential area, home to the largest collection of buildings designed by Mies van der Rohe in the world. Although it's not as well known as you'd think. So today, Lafayette Park is still one of Detroit's most racially integrated and economically stable neighborhoods, although, as you've seen, it's surrounded by evidence of a city in financial distress. So our book looks at the way that residents confront and interact with this modernist environment and the ways in which the community's vitality has persisted over the last 50 years in Detroit. It consists of our book consists of interviews with and essays by current and former residents, reproductions of archival material, much of it found in private collections of residents, and photograph series by Janine Debanay, Karen Jobst, Vasco Roma, and Corinne Vermeulen. So this first image series, this first series is of townhouse residents in their homes. We worked with Corinne Vermeulen, who's a Dutch photographer who's lived in Detroit since 2006. We were interested in sort of documenting the townhouse interiors all from the same angle to sort of underscore the similarities and the differences between each of the residents' homes. It was something that struck us when we were researching for this project. We would meet with people and we were kind of struck by the way, you know, the houses are all exactly the same, but on the inside people do, you know, people live in them however they'd like to. So we sort of wanted this to be like a response to photos one might see of mid-century modern homes in shelter magazines like Dwell, where they might focus exclusively on the sort of more modernist houses. So this is a woman who lived in one of the courthouse units. And then this series is also by Corinne. These are of people who live in residents of the high-rises. There are 3 high-rises in Lafayette Park, which are rentals. And an important factor that's determined the success of the neighborhood is the fact that there's this mix of incomes, or mix of income groups. So they're cooperatively owned townhouses and then also rentals, which attract a mix of longtime residents. There are people like Mr. Parker who have lived in Lafayette Park basically since it was built. And then there's also a more transient population, a lot of students, retirees, single people, new arrivals to the city. And so in the case of these buildings, their success as buildings has a lot, or their success in sort of maintaining a vibrant community has more to do with the ownership of the buildings and the management. So actually in 2008, 2 of the high-rises were bought by a New York-based developer that subsequently defaulted on tax payments and failed to maintain the buildings. And this year they went into foreclosure, so they're now owned by the city of Detroit and managed by HUD. Nonetheless, I have friends who live in the towers and they still have sort of fabulous lives. So it's not, you know, it sort of sounds worse than it actually is. So after this series, the 3rd series of photos will be 6 photos that were taken by Vasco Roma, who's a resident of Lafayette Park. And we worked with Vasco while we were working on the book because we wanted to show to have sort of author photos of all of the people who had contributed. So we asked Vasco to take photos in the evening after it was dark through each resident's front window. And those images are, they're a bit voyeuristic, but they represent pretty accurately what it's like to be in one's house in the evening when anybody walking by can see in. So though one might expect that in Detroit, a city which is famous for high levels of crime, people would prefer to live in bunkers with bars on their windows, Lafayette Park residents often talk about how they feel safer seeing their neighbors come and go and knowing that they too are seen. So sorry that I'm kind of getting off track, or I'm going to sort of move ahead. But so then the next series of photos that will come after Vasco's are called Birds and Plate Glass. And those are 7 photos of birds that died after hitting windows in Lafayette Park. And those were taken by one of my neighbors, the architect Christian Unversagt, and myself. So I actually live in Lafayette Park. And Lafayette Park is situated on a major flyway, so it has a very lush habitat, and it tends to attract a lot of migrating birds. And one aspect of life in the townhouses, which have floor-to-ceiling windows, is that people who live in them tend to be very in touch with nature and the goings-on of wildlife. So it becomes kind of the subject of conversation. And in our book, we also included some email exchanges between residents talking about the various animals, like a family of hawks, a coyote, pheasants, a green heron that somehow ended up on someone's roof, and then squirrels, which are also kind of pests. And then lastly, there'll be I've included a photo, like a mix of photos of buildings that we collected from residents. So these are the birds. At a certain point while we were working on this project, we realized we didn't really have any photos of the exteriors of the buildings. We were focused so much on showing the people that you couldn't really tell what Lafayette Park looks like from the outside. And we thought about trying to ask an architectural photographer to come in and shoot them, but then but then those photos kind of already exist. So we figured our purpose with this project was to show the architecture from the inside out, rather than the other way around. So we put out a call in the neighborhood for photos, and we received thousands of totally unedited photos from people's hard drive. And they ranged in quality from Instagram iPhone shots to sort of higher quality amateur photography to images taken with disposable cameras. And so I've included these after this series. And so those include photos by Cordelia Brown, Lana Cavar, Matt Elliott, Andy Kem, Fritz Klatke, Richard Osterom, Vashko Roma, Jamie Schaefer, Christian Unversagt, Michelle Unversagt, and myself. And I've also included some, so those are starting now. So there's also some ephemera, like scans of newsletters and invitations to potluck picnics and things in the neighborhood. So just to give a little bit of background about Lafayette Park, it's situated in Detroit, just east of downtown, and it was the result of an urban renewal project that was completed in the early 60s. And it was built on land that was once a neighborhood called Black Bottom, which had been a working class, largely African-American neighborhood. And that neighborhood was actually called Black Bottom because of the dark color of the soil, although it came to be home to a large African-American community. It was cleared of its residents and razed in the late 1940s, early 50s, and the city displaced around 8,000 people. And the area actually lay vacant for several years because the city was unable to find a developer willing to take on the land. Eventually, labor activist Walter Reuther, who was then president of United Auto Workers Union, got involved and was able to attract Herbert Greenwald, the developer, and then Greenwald brought in Mies van der Rohe, Ludwig Hilbersheimer to do the urban planning, and landscape designer Alfred Caldwell. So maybe because of Reuther's involvement at the time, Lafayette Park ended up attracting a sort of politically progressive, multiracial population right from the beginning. People who moved in those early days have largely stayed, or I shouldn't say they've largely stayed, but many of those people have stayed. This is a tour group. There's also sometimes tour groups in the neighborhood. So many of the people who have stayed in the neighborhood has managed to remain fairly racially and economically integrated. So our book really, so our kind of interest in Lafayette Park was just that it was not as well known as you'd think. You know, there's this huge collection of Mies van der Rohe buildings right in downtown Detroit, and when I moved to Detroit, I'm not an architect, but I didn't know about these buildings, which was just kind of, and people are sort of, it's unexpected. It doesn't really match, the images we've just seen. It's not what you think of when you see Detroit. Let me just pause on this one. So one resident, the other thing is it seems like it's left out of a lot of the narratives on, not only on Detroit, but on of modernism and sort of the story of Mies van der Rohe. Like one of the people we spoke to remembered going to, or who lives in the neighborhood, remembered coming to New York and going to MoMA for a Mies exhibition in 1986. And it was sort of ticketed as like the most comprehensive exhibition of Mies van der Rohe's work to date. And Lafayette Park there was like a little model of Lafayette Park, and it was captioned as being a suburb of Detroit. And she like tried to chase down the curator and wasn't able to. But it's funny to sort of imagine this particular neighbor trying to find her. But then in 2001, it wasn't in the Mies in America exhibition at the Whitney. Really, I mean, I actually didn't go to the exhibition, but in the catalog, it's mentioned only in a cursory way, and there were that catalog really focused on a few other buildings, but still, I was sort of surprised when I had the catalog just to see it's only like it's in the timeline. It's not really mentioned, and there's sort of countless examples of this at one point there was a sort of prominent historian also described Lafayette Park as being on the edge of a city, on the edge of the city, which seems like kind of a small mistake, but I feel like you would never make that mistake in New York or LA, or you wouldn't accidentally say that it's somewhere where it actually isn't. So in 2004 there was an important book that came out, Case Lafayette Park, which was edited by Charles Waldheim. And that book really helped to call attention to the neighborhood. But even there, Detlef Martens describes it as a little-known jewel of modern urbanism. So you sort of thought about, let me see if I have, these images were kind of going faster than I expected, but I'll see. Okay, I'll let a couple go. But some of the possible reasons for Lafayette Park being sort of underrepresented could be that, firstly, that it's not luxury housing. The high-rises in particular have less in common with Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago and maybe more in common with the Mies' high-rises in New York, New Jersey. And one does, you don't really hear that much about those buildings either. And secondly, people who write about modernism, who sort of create the narrative about modernism, tend not to spend a lot of time in Detroit. Maybe they don't really know the city or have any reason to come to the city. And then one of the contributors to our book, Marcia Music, put it, I thought, in a sort of nice way in her essay, or in a sort of she sort of articulated it well when she said that, quote, an aspect of African American life that is rarely acknowledged or understood by outsiders is the mantle of invisibility that obscures many aspects of life in the Black community, concealing especially non-pathological behavior from the view of mainstream society. So she makes the persuasive case that Lafayette Park is overlooked precisely because it's an integrated neighborhood in a city that is majority Black, which, yeah, so another sort of important way, like I started to mention, that in which Lafayette Park is overlooked, and one that's maybe more pertinent to this panel discussion, is the way it doesn't really fit into dominant narratives about the city itself. It fails to conform to the image of Detroit as an industrial wasteland. It also doesn't quite fit with the more positive, kind of intensely optimistic version of Detroit as a scrappy artist's utopia. So living in Detroit, I often think that the image of the city as an urban wasteland is exaggerated. Like people, you live around the ruins, but you don't, but we don't look at, sort of as Camilo said, there's sort of the image outside the city, perhaps then there's the sort of experience of the city that you have while you're living there, and they don't really match up. So I sometimes, sometimes hear people talking about ruin porn, and I'm like, oh God, why are they talking about this again? But I feel like, but then, a Google search on the word Detroit yielded page after page of photos of abandoned buildings, with the occasional shot of the city skyline or a baseball stadium. And I think I have, those will come in a minute. So, and a few weeks ago, while I was kind of thinking about this, I came across a review in the Washington Post, which was of the two shows at the National Museum of Andrew and Camilo's work. And the title of the show was Detroit's Fast Lane to Disintegration. And the first paragraph read, the quote, the urban worst-case scenario known as Detroit has been compared to Pompeii and circa 1946 Hiroshima. But the erstwhile Motor City wasn't destroyed by a natural disaster or an atomic bomb. It succumbed to sheer carelessness. It's as if a major metropolis shriveled in the dryer or rotted in the back of the refrigerator. End quote. So then the review goes on to describe some of the scenes captured in the photos of vacant lots and empty buildings. And then in Vergara's case, evidence of people's attempts over the years to rebuild and then tidy up parts of the city. And I know these articles are these sorts of reviews can sometimes really oversimplify a project in a frustrating way. But nonetheless, what was actually depressing about that article was just how ordinary it was and unsurprising. Like this is kind of the way Detroit is described often. And, and it's weird because I've lived there for 7 years, and I have to say, I'm not from there originally, but then you start to get this kind of, I think everybody feels this in the city, where you start to get this kind of, you start to feel responsible for it somehow. So, as a resident, I think what bothers me most about the article, or those like it, is the portrayals of those who live there, or who choose to live there. Because for those who have lived in Detroit through it all since the 1950s, they're sort of charged with, quote, not bothering to take care of the city, with allowing these spectacular buildings to fall into disrepair. And then given that the majority of the people living in Detroit are African American and or working class, a sentence like, "It succumbed to sheer carelessness," appears to place judgment on the race and class of the people, of the city's residents. The global flow of capital, the effects of NAFTA on manufacturing, the fact that Detroit is one of dozens of post-industrial cities struggling to function is not acknowledged. So one of our goals with Thanks for the View, Mr. Mies, was simply to take stock of what's happening in Detroit and in Lafayette Park in particular, and to attempt to intervene in these conversations. There's something kind of sobering about life in Detroit. It doesn't really, a lot of it doesn't really make sense, but I would, especially when you have like scenes like this next to, there's an abandoned building right there. They're kind of everywhere. So, it's kind of, so there's a way in which it's difficult to reconcile these sort of two realities. But I would argue that we should study the complexity of the city's successes rather than its failures. And then.
It's a great pleasure to be back here, and I'd like to thank Bob for organizing this event, which is opening a discussion I think is really very relevant and timely, not only in Detroit, but also beyond Detroit, as I think the location of this event here testifies to. And I'd also like to say it's a really great privilege to be on a panel with three people whose work I admire and esteem and have learned a great deal from. The image that you're looking at here might look like the opposite of the sort of images that Andrew and Camilo have shown, and to some extent Danielle too. It might look like an image of Detroit's boom before its bust, its rise before its fall, its time of growth and prosperity and development before its time of decline and decay and impoverishment. It might look like an image of the city whose ruin is documented in Andrew and Camilo's photography. And to some extent, it is such an image. But what I want to suggest tonight is that it's possible to glimpse another narrative in this image and in the other images we've seen tonight. A narrative not so much of a city that has fallen into ruin, but rather of a city where ruin is and always has been conjoined with development. In other words, rather than understanding Detroit's development and its ruin as discrete moments, moments that are arrayed in a historical sequence, a sequence that implies decline or decay, it's also possible to understand development and ruin as conjoined or even inseparable moments. And if they are such moments, then the appearance of development, the appearance of growth, the appearance of prosperity would always be tied to and could often conceal the appearance of ruin elsewhere. And the appearance of ruin is also tied to and could also conceal the appearance of development, growth, and prosperity elsewhere. Andrew quoted Octavio Paz, who claimed that buildings are incorruptible witnesses to the passage of time. In a certain sense, what I'm going to offer you is a kind of counter proposition, a proposition that at times buildings might be quite corruptible witnesses, witnesses whose testimony might very usefully solicit cross-examination. So you might want to understand what follows as my cross-examination. And it's a cross-examination that takes the form of two kinds of comparisons. First, I'm going to compare images of ruin in Detroit now to images of ruin that took place in Detroit's historic boom in the 1920s and the 1930s. And then I'm going to compare contemporary images of Detroit's ruin to the development and the growth and the prosperity that's taking place right now in the midst of the ruin of Detroit's central city. So in doing this, what I want to suggest is that Detroit's story might not be so much a story of boom and bust, but a story about the movement of capital, about the redistribution of capital, about the extraction of capital from the center of Detroit to ever more distant metropolitan and subsequently global locations. So in that story, the story of uneven development, we could understand Andrew and Camilo's photography as perhaps the latest and certainly the most vivid moment in a visual inspection of ruin, an inspection that has been carried out in Detroit ever since the city began to modernize in the 1920s, which is one of the things I want to suggest tonight. And we could understand Danielle's project as offering us a way to glimpse the intimate but often overlooked relationship between development and ruin. Now, contemporary images of Detroit certainly imply a contrast with other images, earlier images, images of Detroit at a time when buildings were occupied, when they were intact, when they were functional, when they contributed to growth and prosperity. Detroit's now abandoned automobile factories are, of course, a leading protagonist in this story. Detroit's many abandoned single-family houses are also a protagonist in this story. Factories and houses, as we've seen tonight, are icons of Detroit's current bust, but they're also protagonists in another story, a story about industrial capitalism working itself out in such a way as to ruin the central part of Detroit. If Detroit is considered as a political entity, and that's the entity that you see shaded in gray here, then from the year 1910 until 1985, no automobile factory was built in Detroit. All of Detroit's automobile factories were built outside the incorporated city of Detroit, in places like Hamtramck and Highland Park, which are separate municipal enclaves carved into Detroit, and then in places like Dearborn, Romeo, Sterling Heights, Warren, and then over the decades in ever more distant locations, in locations where factory owners were free from paying taxes in and to the municipality of Detroit, in places where factory owners could control municipal governments, in places where factory owners could battle labor activism, and this of course is a battle that's still continuing today. Now, one of the first effects of the growth of the auto industry was certainly urban development, the expansion of Detroit's central business district, and this is the expansion that yielded the theaters, the hotels, the office building, the schools that have since fallen into ruin and offered themselves as documents of Detroit's decline and fall. And this also yielded a vast network of single-family houses. These were houses for workers in the auto industry, which was giving both directly and indirectly a whole ensemble of benefits to keep workers diligent, loyal, and hopefully anti-union, the single-family house being an important part of that ensemble. But as the images that I'm about to show you, I think, testify to, the growth of the auto industry also yielded the deterioration of many central city neighborhoods in Detroit. In other words, as the auto industry moved capital and jobs to Detroit's metropolitan outskirts, neighborhoods in the city center suffered, and this resulted in houses being abandoned, and houses falling into ruin, and shops and businesses closing, their premises being boarded up, their buildings vacated. And it also resulted in an intensified racial segregation of the city. In other words, as former ethnically defined communities were transformed into communities that were defined by racial distinctions, communities that were organized by access to loans, access to neighborhoods, and a whole range of other legal and extra-legal forms of discrimination. What you're looking at here is an image of the segregated neighborhood that, as Danielle mentioned, was demolished in the early 1950s to make way for a highway that connected the central business district of Detroit to the suburbs. And this was the project that created the site that Lafayette Park eventually occupied. In 1928, This is a year before the Great Depression. This is a year when the auto industry was booming. This is a year when Detroit was growing faster than any other American city except Los Angeles. A doctoral student at the University of Michigan submitted a dissertation, and the subject of his dissertation was the urban geography of Detroit. And what this student found himself doing, among other things, was documenting urban decay, urban deterioration, urban ruin. And these are all things that he, as a good Chicago school student, he called transition. And this took the form of factories that were vacant or abandoned, homes of the affluent or even the middle class that were turned into rooming houses, or residences for the working class, which he called cheap hotels, or apartment buildings that had to be supplemented by shops and stores, or houses that were simply boarded up and left vacant. And this was all emerging in neighborhoods around the center of Detroit. These were neighborhoods that were destroyed by the extraction of capital for reinvestment around the newly developing automobile factories on Detroit's periphery. And of course, in subsequent decades, this dynamic would only intensify as the auto industry further decentralized, so that by the 1950s, central city neighborhoods in Detroit would continue to deteriorate in white, but more particularly in black working class sections of what was still a segregated city. So what I want to suggest is that historical images of Detroit's uneven development to some extent blur into images that may already be familiar to you, images that we've seen tonight, images of a city that seems to be falling into ruin. A city that's occupied by hundreds of thousands of underemployed, unemployed, and impoverished people, as well as has been mentioned today by an emerging population of a so-called creative class. So, as well as seeing Andrew and Camilo's photography as a visual discovery of a city that has fallen into ruin, I'd like to pose it also as the latest and by far the most vivid moment in a history of visual inspection of the urban sites of capital extraction. And this is an inspection that has been continuously carried out since Detroit has been a modern city. And it's an inspection that has been undertaken in a variety of photographic genres according to any number of aesthetic parameters. Now, if we have forgotten the bust that was taking place during Detroit's historic boom, as I've tried to suggest, we're also forgetting the boom that's taking place right now. And this suggests a second set of images, images of the burgeoning metropolitan periphery around Detroit, of places like Farmington Hills, Troy, Southfield, Sterling Heights, St. Clair Shores, Bloomfield Hills. These are places where much of the capital that has been extracted from Detroit has been reinvested. These are places that have been transformed from suburbs and townships into edge cities. These are cities that have bustling downtowns, office parks, shopping centers, big box stores, apartment complexes, condominiums, owner-occupied homes of the middle class and the affluent. So if the fall of the central city, which is what's so beautifully documented by Andrew and Camilo, and the effort to recover from that fall, which is so beautifully documented by Danielle, is enmeshed with the rise of the edge city, then perhaps Detroit has not simply fallen into decline, as the prevailing narratives claim, and as images of ruin often seem to verify, but Detroit maybe has also been always both rising up and falling down, both being made and unmade. And I think this is a process that images of ruin can also solicit us to see. So I'd like to end here, and I guess we now open the floor for discussion.
Some of you may have discovered we turned the heat off right now. come up and open it up for questions at the end. To begin, I want to ask Andrew Moore and Camilo and Danielle if they wanted to comment on Andrew Herscher's remarks. Any of you like to?
Sure.
Those were great images. Those were great images, and that map of that map of the slums versus the exclusive, I forget, or like exclusive housing was kind of nuts.
Yeah.
But nice to see.
I mean, I have some comments.
Oh, go ahead. You take your 15 seconds.
I think we're dealing with something that's called the size of the beast. So surely any city has some abandonment. I mean, you know, you can go to really fancy places and find abandoned or vacant houses that are vacant for a period of time. So as a photographer, I got the feeling that, I mean, the photographs that we saw of abandonment were usually single units. And I have a feeling that when Andrew showed the whole block, there was a freeway being built a block or two away, and that's the reason why those houses were abandoned. Detroit, I believe, had 20,000 houses knocked down just to build a very complex system of freeways. See, freeways is the word that was not present in Andrew's presentation. And the freeways really had the tremendous role of getting the people out of Detroit so they could move and occupy those new houses that were being built at the rate of 10,000 a year in the suburbs of Detroit. Before those houses were built, people were still living in Detroit. They were still shopping in the commercial streets. So those places, see the difference of scale, it's immense. When you're talking about a few hundreds is one thing, when you're talking about tens of thousands, and I hate to throw in the figure, but I read the figure that there are 70,000 abandoned structures in Detroit today. It may not be, you know, it may not be exact and accurate, but that gives you some sense of the magnitude of the thing. That's my comment.
Should we open it up for questions from the audience? Okay. Questions, comments? Yes.
My name is Brooke. I am in the historic preservation program here, and I'm a conservation student. So I love, and you brought up the term ruin porn. It is kind of like a fetish of mine, I have to admit, just because I'm such a materials person, and I love peeling paint. Oh, okay. And I love peeling paint and everything. It's just always, and I grew up in Baltimore, which is kind of another, it's considered a Rust Belt city. I mean, it's not a northern city, but so I grew up around kind of fallen neighborhoods, and that weird kind of dichotomy between thriving and not thriving right next to each other. My question is, I noticed this particularly towards Camilo and Andrew. I noticed that when you were talking, you have a kind of romance with these buildings. And as historic preservation has a tendency to come in and kind of anesthetize old buildings and make them very cute and quaint. Do you have a concern that with this renewed interest in ruin porn, that's going to perk up a lot of interest in doing, sort of coming in and wiping the slate clean and scraping off, sort of like what they saw, sort of what they saw in Soho, for example, where, you know, they ruined all the beautiful graffiti and scraped off all the, and now everything is just kind of cookie cutter.
Well, okay. It was interesting to, you know, if you talk to a neighbor living next to a burnt out house, 201, they would say, this is terrible, this is an awful building, tear this down. I mean, we're you know, so there's there's the single-family houses that are ruined that are, you know, in most cases not of great value, I would say, and probably will be and should be torn down. In terms of larger buildings, you know, it's a huge city. I think it would take decades actually for it all to be whitewashed. But there are people in Detroit today who say, you know, I don't want to lose my parking spot. I don't want Detroit to change. I want it just to be the way it is. I don't want all these people coming in. And, you know, of course change is inevitable. And I think with this whole discussion, there are obviously college educated, I love that term, moving to Detroit. I don't think that's enough to tip the scale. But it's a huge canvas, although that sounds like an aesthetic judgment on it, but it's true. I mean, it would be hard to whitewash the whole city, and I think that, and I think there will be already some pushback on that from the local residents.
Yes, yes. I think Andrew and I should be paid for being ruined pornographers. I think that the salvation of Detroit consists on its uniqueness. I think failure leads to success in the case of Detroit. And it does because there is nowhere in the world, as far as I believe, such a massive amount of buildings and you know, streets, you know, the whole city. As in Detroit. So obviously Detroit is becoming a more and more powerful symbol. I think, you know, on the one hand, the pictures, which are play a role certainly, but I think we're being bypassed. What's coming is the filmmakers, you know, and we are left behind. I also think we are. Maybe you can blame us for trailblazing or something, but also I think what you should look at is other cities that don't have the bulk of Detroit, that they don't have the presence of Detroit, or the, you know, that they don't capture the imagination the way Detroit does. And I'll mention some. Cleveland, another one. Gary, Indiana. What's happening to Gary, Indiana? There are no ruined pornographers going to Gary. There is no steer on. Gary's dying.
Completely.
Yeah.
Gary is awesome.
East St. Louis. Camden, New Jersey.
Bob, can I just quick response? Memory, on some level, is a commodity. You have to pay for it. And so my question for historic preservation is, what are you exchanging for your purchase of memory? And for whom is memory affordable? For whom isn't it?
I know, it's a hard question. We wrestle with that every day.
Yeah. Can I add a little thing too?
Yeah, add a little.
Yeah, it's a very little thing. Unless you're insane, I mean, what Andrew said is perfectly true, but there are people who are truly insane, and they would do everything against their monetary interest. So they would do stuff like this, even though there is no reward, or no reward that may be coming in any possible way. I would love to put myself into that situation, although reward eventually came. But I think you're basically right.
Questions? Any more questions?
Comments? No?
Do you have any comments, Bob?
I thought this was great. I thought all of you did a wonderful job. I love seeing I always love seeing the images again. I saw images I hadn't seen before. I think this is one of the concerns I've had in the last few years about the way we teach urban planning at the school is we don't teach enough about images. We don't teach enough about different ways to represent the city. And photographs are one way to do it. They're not an easy way to do it. They're very freighted. They pose all kinds of interpretive issues. But the planners who like to turn things into kind of quantification and numbers and GIS maps, this is another useful tool to do this. The cities are these very complex, hybrid, shape-shifting things that I don't think can be represented only one way. You have to think of multiple ways to do it, and these photographs, I think, start us down that path. I mean, the other thing about some of these photographs is that they're just so evocative. I mean, they just require kind of engagement in more than just a documentation. That would be just one comment on this. And you see some of the things that, just to compare these two people with Danielle's, not her photographs, but kind of photographs, shows the people. Those are just fascinating photographs of the way that people are occupying these spaces, particularly from the outside, looking in. Yeah. Right?
Right.
It gives you the sense of this place, which, if you ever go to Detroit, go to this place. Go to Lafayette Park.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing for me as a person who lives in Detroit is with all the ruins, is that they're completely, they're so spectacular. Like you kind of have to photograph them as soon as as anybody comes to visit. It's like they can't help it. It's some kind of automatic. They're taking pictures all the time. And I mean, I also had that impulse. And I think the thing that for me was kind of important was trying to figure out how to be there. Like the thing that happens in Detroit is people spend all their time talking about Detroit and about the fact that they live in Detroit and what's happening to Detroit and why is it like this and why, what can we do to fix it? And everybody's got big ideas and pop-up shops, and it's just like we're gonna do all these positive things. But I think that the thing about the ruins is I think the reason that people who live in Detroit are sometimes, well, I mean, there's many reasons why you're not so keen on seeing the aestheticization of the ruins is because you feel like it's kind of like finding you're like, but right next to it, there's a restaurant that's doing okay. Or like, you're trying to, people are trying to make things work and you feel like just back up a little bit and then you'll see there's a building next to it where somebody's living or there's a bike path that's been put in. I mean, but as Camilo said, it's just like, it's overwhelming. They're abandoned they're buildings that have just gone abandoned in the last 6 months and then they just start to collapse and you see it before your eyes. But I think that as you live there, or as I've lived there, I felt like the ruins is kind of the first thing you see, and then part of doing our project was like this thing of trying to figure out a longer term way to relate to the city, like figuring out how do you, that's like the first line of attack are those abandoned buildings, but then after you sort of stay there, what sinks in and how to, try to kind of represent the life in a way.
Right, and it's kind of a dual thing because you have that, and that's why people come. But then once you're there, you want to go to you want to have a nice meal once in a while or go out. So, and I think the question of whether will the I don't want to say success, but I know there are certain cases where there's its interior in particular. Where there were busloads of ruined photography. They were waiting in line literally to take this photo, and the piano, and eventually it just got destroyed. I mean, and so success really ruined it, and so so there's like success porn or something. I mean, and that's as we were saying, would be an incredible process in Detroit because of the scale of it, but. I think, things can change very quickly, and I think it seems to be already in some sense. I mean, maybe it's just in the downtown, but that's a locus for other changes. And some of the very wealthy businessmen in Detroit are very committed to transforming the downtown.
Gavin?
Curious how people in Detroit have perceived your work, if you've gotten feedback either in local newspapers or media or personal things that have been said to you about your projects?
I've gotten asked that question before, and there's the people. Yeah, why don't you start?
What good things they said about you? Camilo's the one who proposed that the downtown office building should be turned into a abandonment.
No, I will. It's just that it's difficult. It's difficult to go there and do it, I mean, I feel a commitment to the buildings. I feel a commitment to what I have photographed. I feel like I have to, see the story unravel. I have to wait until the end, until my end, of course, because Detroit is going to last longer than I last. So what do people say? It's just, they're sort of doubtful whether to give me the title of a ruined pornographer or not. So the fact that I started relatively early, which is 1987, makes them, kind of recoil. I mean, why is this guy coming back? Why does he keep coming back? And I go there and I get together with all these people who sort of are the ones that brand, the ones that give the names. When you say the people that, what do people say about your work? I mean, 99.9% of the people don't even care or know about my work. So, you take 700,000 people, there's probably 650 of them are black, they're poor. If they had money, most likely they would move out. Unless those of Lafayette Park, of course, are exceptional. And then you have the white kids that are extremely vocal, and that, of course, they're the ones that have taken possession of the city, because that gives them a moral authority and a moral position. They are nobody when they are living in Ohio. They move to Detroit. They are pioneers. They are visionaries. They are people who are superior to their parents. And they're very likable people. I'm not saying this, so they are the ones that brand. They're the ones that go in the internet. And they are very, very effective, in creating this reality and this dialogue that's going on. So at one point, you feel that there is more of Detroit in the internet than there is in the city itself. So I don't know if that answers your question. You probably have.
I think that's absolutely true. When people say, "What are the people to?" I think, yeah, 9/10 aren't even aware of what the books and the shows and there's a very vocal minority, and many of whom some of them don't even live in Detroit, and they'll live outside of the city, and then. I think the ones who actually, and then there's a division. I mean, I know I have plenty of friends who live there who are more, kind of sensitive and realize that, yeah, this is something amazing. At the same time, we have to deal with it and move on and take it in stride. But
well, on that, we will draw to a close. I want to thank our speakers.
I didn't thank you at all, without thanking you.